Hi, and welcome to the Did You Know Crypto podcast. Today is a great interview with Christopher Bendiksen of Coinshares, where we are talking about the evergreen topic of Bitcoin energy usage. Now, this is something that's very important. It's going to be coming up a lot more as we move forward. Just trust me. This is going to be an episode and a guest we're going to be talking probably more with in the future. I think you're going to really enjoy it. He is in London, so we were calling over a phone. So the audio is not as good. My end too, there's a little bit of background noise, but overall I think it's very good and the content is superb. If you want to help out, please go over to iTunes, leave a 5-star and a written review if you can. That's the biggest thing that you can do. If you want to help out further, please go over to supportmypodcast.com. That's supportmypodcast.com. You can see all the different ways, from shopping through Amazon to supporting us with Bitcoin on Bitbacker and every other way. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the show. Today, I'd like to welcome Christopher Bendiksen, head of research at Coinshares, a company comprised of financial industry alumni offering private strategies and 2 exchange-traded Bitcoin and Ether notes, the first of their kind in the industry. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The majority of the episode's going to be talking about Bitcoin mining energy usage, but first, I'd like to hear about your personal journey. So why don't we let the listeners know a little bit about yourself and how Bitcoin found you?
Sure. I don't know how far back we're going to go. I grew up in Norway, kind of in rural middle of nowhere, and made my way sort of to the States to go to university, where I met some really interesting people who later were going to introduce me to Bitcoin. Sort of traveled around a bit, finished a master's degree in Barcelona in biophysics, ended up in London, started working in finance, got introduced to Bitcoin then through an old friend from the States, and sort of fell headlong down the rabbit hole. Then, Bitcoin wasn't really that big for a while. It didn't really have any sort of full-time opportunities available to almost anyone. You're sort of super privileged if you're able to work with Bitcoin full-time. Then I met Ryan Radloff, our CEO at Coinshares, at a conference here in London, which was your archetypical 2015 conference of blockchain, not Bitcoin, just a bunch of lawyers. Absolutely awful, actually. And we kind of connected based on just basically making fun of everyone that was there. We were talking about how you can have blockchains without native tokens, and mining was unnecessary. You didn't even need any of that, and sort of became friends. And when he partnered up with Danny Masters and the global guys to create Coinshares out of XBT Provider and Ryan's plan for sort of world domination, I joined in as the head of research, and that was in August 2017. So it's been a while now. It's been almost 2 years. So while there, I've concentrated on doing educational research. We're still at the level where we feel like the most value we can get out of research output at this point is essentially just educating investors and prospective investors, getting them comfortable with the asset class and getting them comfortable with how everything works and what they need to pay attention to. So that's sort of what I'm doing and what our focus is at the moment.
Now, this question I find to be quite instructive, and it varies, depending on the person, their background, and where they come to Bitcoin from. But what is Bitcoin to you, and how do you define it?
It's a new monetary system. I would be my definition. mean, you know, as you know, you can take this however far and wide you want, but I see it as the opportunity to recreate our entire monetary system based on sound money and non third party involvement to the largest extent possible. Trust minimization, essentially.
And the reason that I wanted to have you on, and we've been trying to set this up for a little while, but we had different time zones and it was just a little bit difficult to actually get our schedules together. But you did send out a tweet storm in conjunction with the Coinshares white paper that was released on Bitcoin mining energy usage, and this was in early November, December timeframe. It was extremely well done, and I think everybody in the space appreciated it. And this specific topic of Bitcoin mining energy usage has been kind of an elephant in the room for a lot of people in the space. It was discussed in my interview with Caitlin Long a while back, and we were basically talking about it. She brought up how a lot of these reports that are released are done kind of with barroom napkin type of calculations that they use to basically besmirch Bitcoin and its energy usage. And this, I think, is going to be an attack vector for the future of Bitcoin. In the past, it was linked to dark markets, or it could be used to fund terrorism, those types of things. And those tropes still exist and they still pop up on occasion. But I think especially with the move towards more environmental concerns, and in the United States we have now an emphasis on a quote-unquote Green New Deal, that this is going to be something that's going to get latched onto. And as Bitcoin provides more and more of an actual threat to the status quo of the central banks, that this will be a very popular attack vector against Bitcoin in the future.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think you're right. This definitely is sort of a topic of the times, which is partly why we started latching onto it. I mean, it's definitely true that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. The sort of difference is that, first of all, not everyone thinks that's a bad thing. I mean, planes use a lot more energy than wooden ships. A washing machine uses more energy than you do just washing clothes in a bucket. Like, automation requires energy. Progress in civilization requires energy. So part of the reason why I think Bitcoin got sort of such a bad rep is that, or at least in these publications that didn't really look through their sources too well, is that the power consumption got coupled with an incorrect assumption that China is a particularly dirty place. There's just a little prejudice in my mind. I mean, the argument goes sort of something like this: all miners are in China, and China is the dirty place where electricity production is particularly bad, and it's all done with coal plants. And we had done a bunch of sort of anecdotal background research on this, and it's been known for years within the mining industry that this couldn't possibly be true, because nobody that we ever talked to were aware of anyone that were mining using fossil fuels. And the reason was not because of trying to save the environment or anything like that. It was just too expensive. Fossil fuels, I mean, Bitcoin mining is a global absolute race to the bottom of electricity prices. If you don't have the cheapest electricity out there, somebody else will, and they will mine with it, and they will beat you out of the market. So we figured that there's got to be something that's not really right here, and we decided to get to the bottom of it. Because I mean, I have to admit, like, even when this narrative first came out, like, I was like, wow, that is bad. Like, if that is the case, then that's not good. We are in a period of human civilization where we are in sort of like a transition period over to renewable energy. And while I'm normally I'm not even a proponent of being cautious with energy use in a transition period like this. We kind of have to, because we don't have an energy expenditure problem. We have an energy production problem. We create too much energy from fossil fuels. That's our problem. Not that we spend a ton of it, but in the transition process where we have to transition from fossil fuels to renewables without it becoming incredibly expensive real quick and ruining our economy, we do actually have to be a little bit careful. But so we started looking into this in a little bit more detail, because the anecdotal stories that we heard didn't fit this narrative at all. We only knew of one place really where Bitcoin mining was done at a significant level using coal, and it's in Inner Mongolia, and there's that Bitmain facility there that got a lot of publicity a bunch of years ago. So you can sort of see how this narrative came together. I mean, it's sort of a previously industrialized, now slightly more de-industrialized area where you could set up these like warehouses for really cheap and get access to super cheap electricity, and that happened to be coal. But in almost every other case, like all the miners we spoke to were like, no, we actually mine with hydro because it's way cheaper. And first we were puzzled. We were wondering, like, how come hydro is so cheap? And then it started dawning on us then that most of these people are mining on hydropower that is heavily underutilized. So either it's sitting in areas where they had a large build out of hydro demand, and then of hydro capacity, and then industrial demand either didn't quite materialize as anticipated, or there used to be a lot larger level of industrialization around that area, and then some of these clients left. So this, for example, is the case quite often in the United States, and in Russia, whereas in China, you had an outright just over investment in hydro because they were aiming really hard at becoming the world's premier smelter of aluminum, which they now are, but they went way too far. So as we sort of started doing this, we figured, well, why don't we actually try and quantify this? Why don't we try and see like what the actual number is? Because we had looked around and there just didn't seem to be very much out there. You had a bunch of research reports that are sort of trying their hand at this, but kind of coming at it from the opposite direction that I would like to see it. Like, so first of all, their assumptions were kind of poor. The assumptions were essentially that most mining is in China, and therefore let's just assume that China is a proxy for the entire network. Then they also didn't split China into its appropriate regions as it should be. I mean, China is a gigantic place. It's got 1.3 billion people. Like, not every part of China is the same. I mean, it almost sounds a little silly to sit here and say that, because you'd think it's so obvious, but apparently not. So we decided to try and look up, first of all, like, where are the miners? Not just on a country by country basis, but within the country. So we've had an extremely deep dive into the sort of underworld of mining, if you will. It's an extremely relationship driven industry where people keep their cards like really close to their chest. Like, nobody likes to talk about anything. Like, nobody wants to give you any information. Everyone thinks you're going to screw them over. People, you want to hear something absolutely crazy? You have some miner whose perspective it is, when we contact them, we go, we're doing these mining reports. We're partly just trying to shine some positive light on mining and help everyone's public image, because we feel like it's been unfairly downtrodden. And some of the perspectives that we got out of miners are, we don't want that. We want to have a bad reputation. We don't want to have a good reputation, because then we get more competitors. So it's been it's a very challenging research environment. But so anyway, after spending hundreds of hours like trawling, calling around, talking to as many people as we can, trawling message boards, forums, like reading every article about every new mine that is opened, ever, and mapping this all out. We teamed up with some friends of ours from a company called Three Body Capital, and they got us access to renewables penetration data. So essentially, the breakdown of electricity generation by source on a provincial Chinese level, which was kind of like the breakthrough in data point that we needed. We didn't have access to that before, and they were able to get it. And as soon as we found that, we could sort of start placing miners like regionally on a map. And then our assumptions are very simple, and that's not because we think that the mining industry is very simple. It's just because we don't see the need to make this complicated right now to prove our point, and we think that easier assumptions are easier to talk about, and we don't want to hide behind like complexity or anything like that. We just want to have our assumptions be easy enough that you either agree with them or you don't, and if you don't, you can articulate your reason why you don't agree with them, and then we can either agree to disagree, or have a simple debate about it, whether instead of this like complex debate of this isn't quite right, or this has a nuance to it. We try and make it a lot simpler. So our assumptions are pretty easy. Like we've split the world into 4 groups. One of them is Sichuan, where we think that 80% of Chinese mining happens, and we think that 60% of mining happens in China, which means that 48% of global mining happens in Sichuan. Then we have the rest of China as another group. Then we have all relevant non-Chinese countries, states, and provinces. And then we have sort of the rest of the world. So 4 groups. So our assumptions are pretty easy. They assume that within the non-Sichuan China group, mining is pretty evenly distributed, and the same goes for the outside of China provinces. So we're saying that in all the relevant sort of non-Chinese provinces, mining is evenly distributed, like across like Washington State, Oregon, New York, Quebec, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, so forth. And then there's sort of the rest of the world. And then we give our estimates for where we think the global mining share is, which is 48% Sichuan, 12% remaining China, 35% non-Chinese relevant regions, and then 5% like rest of the world, if you will, which is like small scale places. There's some stuff happening in like Australia, and we hear about stuff happening in Miami. Doesn't make sense to me, but it apparently happens. There's like Arizona, continental Europe, it's a little bit of everywhere, but small scale. So then you essentially take the renewables penetration for each of those groups. So for Sichuan, for example, Sichuan is 90.1% powered by renewables on an annual basis. It's important to note that because the power production in Sichuan is very seasonally dependent. There's a wet season, and then there's a regular season and a dry season. And in the wet season, it rains a ton, and they produce way more electricity than the grid can even handle. And in the dry season, they produce a lot less, and they have to supplement with fossil fuels. Hence why you get that like last 10%, if you will, of fossil generation in there. So you essentially you multiply the renewables penetration with the global mining share for each of these major mining regions, four of them. And when we do that, you actually come out with a global total share of renewables penetration in Bitcoin mining of almost 78%. And this makes a lot more sense when you compare it to, first of all, what the miners say themselves. Like almost all of them say that they're mining using very cheap hydro contracts. And if you look at where they all are, I mean, this makes total sense. They're all in like Sichuan and Yunnan provinces in China, with the exception of some that are still in Inner Mongolia and like Xinjiang. And then in the West, they're all in the Pacific Northwest, or Quebec, upstate New York, on the St. Lawrence River Basin. And in Europe, they're in like Iceland and Scandinavia, and to a certain extent like Western Russia. And then there's a stronghold in the Caucasus. Like, these are all mountainous, rainy regions with lots of hydropower. Like, this should kind of be obvious to people that look into this in detail. So that's sort of like their journey on how we ended there. And I mean, 77.6% renewables penetration. I mean, that's a lot higher than the global average. Like, the global average is 18.2. And by the way, as like a funny point in this, sort of against the whole China electricity generation is particularly dirty, like China is actually ahead of the global average. So people need to check their sort of anti-Chinese prejudice here. They're actually doing quite well on the global scale. So that's sort of how we started thinking about this, and where we ended up where we are. Hopefully, I mean, we're trying to add more precision and accuracy into the models. But it comes at the, let me put it like this: say that we mapped out like every miner on the planet and put them all on a map. Like, it's actually not that interesting and great for Bitcoin. So it's a little bit of a discussion on whether or not that's something we should even strive for.
Well, I guess that's a different topic of mining centralization, but that could be discussed at a later date. But the Chinese themselves, the government policies, have been actually pushing, as far as from what I've been able to read, a percentage of miners are starting to leave China just based on the government policies and just not being very favorable to them at all. And that kind of rolls right into something that you discussed in the white paper, which was the kind of mobile mining operations. And when most people think of Bitcoin miners, they're not thinking of, mobility. They're not thinking of, they're thinking of something they saw in a Forbes or Wall Street Journal article, and they showed the pictures of these massive warehouses with floor to ceiling stacked, computer equipment with, lights flashing and whatever, right? It looks very kind of server warehouse-y, and does not look like something that would be very mobile. As it seems like many of these miners are just kind of scrambling to find the cheapest renewable energy sources, the cheapest energy that they can find. Have you continued to research kind of this phenomenon of these mobile mining operations kind of scrawling all over the place, looking for these cheaper energy sources?
Yeah, this is something that we're trying to incorporate into our models. I mean, when we first heard of this, like, I was quite surprised. I hadn't really imagined that this was a thing, but yeah, it turns out a lot of miners. This is particularly a Chinese phenomenon, and it relates heavily to the different seasons of wet and dry, especially in the heavily hydro producing regions. But yeah, we learned that a lot of miners are pretty nomadic, and they'll move their gear around extremely opportunistically. They'll pack up a place in a couple of weeks, ship it literally across the country, set up a new spot, and resume again. And what's almost even more shocking is that we hear stories about upwards towards 20% loss rates of gear through the transition process, which sounds extreme to me, but this is what we're hearing. So this nomadism of mining is something that we're trying to account for. It's just a little bit hard to know exactly where it is that they're always going, and I always have an aversion to add complexity to models where simplicity will do, especially if you can't gain any much more accuracy without sort of putting on the paint quite heavily with your assumptions. But it's something that we're looking at. And besides that, there's a big trend of miners just wanting to leave China, which we can all imagine why that's the case. I mean, the government's not very friendly towards the Communist Party, large government, that is. Local governments seem quite happy for the income. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there between the central government and the local government.
You see a lot of the arguments in these newspapers when they make the environmental claim. It seems like there's two groups of people that latch onto this. It's either the folks that already didn't like Bitcoin, and this is just a thing for them to throw out there for another reason why the thing they don't like is also bad. And then those who have never actually looked into Bitcoin and are against any kind of environmental damage and just read one article and then decide that now, because Bitcoin uses energy and quote unquote large amounts of it, that it is inherently bad just because of this. And I think that this is kind of a problem on our end because it's a lack of education on our part of trying and there are a lot of people out there right now that do great work educating the public. It's just a slow crawl, but I think it's just a total lack of education on why does that energy need to be used? What is it actually used for? And there is a profit incentive. I mean, that is why the network works, and that's what secures the network. But the disconnect, I think, is in people understanding why Bitcoin is important. That is still the part that is lacking, because to most outsiders, it just sounds like a bunch of internet nerds with their internet nerd money, and not something actually world changing and important and necessary to use this amount of energy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I mean, when you take a couple steps back, it's like funny almost. It's like how can a bunch of internet nerds possibly muster enough money to pay for $5 billion worth of electricity on an annual basis? It's incredible.
Now, what I'm hopeful for, and this is not my idea, this has been bandied about by others as a concept, is that Bitcoin and its miners, as they continually search for cheaper energy, unlike, say, some sort of regulation by government agencies or some sort of supranational agency and imposing restrictions, is actually offering a profit incentive for entrepreneurs to create better, more efficient forms of energy, and even possibly to incentivize nation states. And I don't know how you feel about nuclear energy, but in your report you talked about 22% of the non-renewable energy was coming from fossil fuels and or other, including nuclear. And I feel if you could have Bitcoin being nearly 100% renewables and nuclear, I think that would be the best option for the least environmental impact for such a important project. Considering that if you're just concerned mostly with emissions as being the biggest problem as far as for environmental impact, then it would be extremely green, if we could combine nuclear and renewables as being what's powering the network. Hey folks, I hope that you're enjoying this episode as much as we are. I don't have any sponsors, so if you could go over to supportmypodcast.com, you'll see all the different ways that you can support the podcast, from Amazon links to a bunch of other stuff. You could back us on Bitbacker with crypto. But most of all, if you can go to iTunes and leave a 5-star and a written review, it'd be very, very helpful. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that, especially modern nuclear energy with fuel cycles that leave you with isotopes at the end that have half-lives that are on the order of 10,000 years instead of millions and billions. I mean, on a geological time scale, that's practically nothing. So, I mean, I'm not against nuclear power by any stretch of the imagination, and I think especially right now in this type of sort of serious circumstance, the cost benefit ratio really makes sense. And there's fusion, which is that perpetually 50 years away, which would obviously solve everything. But I mean, to me, Bitcoin has sort of sailed in as just a private solution to subsidies of renewables production in remote areas. We now really have the chance to just build out renewable energy production where the cost is the lowest, which, as we all know, does not tend to be around exactly where people live. Solar power is most efficient when you put it in a desert in the middle of nowhere where nobody lives and it's always sunny and it never rains. Hydropower happens to be generated in mountainous regions with large rainfalls, and people tend to live on coastal plains and in valleys. So, we now have a chance to. A lot of the reason why this power is so cheap in the first place is that it's too far from the demand, and a lot of times you need a certain scale for it to even make sense to connect it to the grid, and this requires an immediate, a huge front-loaded capex expenditure, and it's really hard to do in one sort of big go like that. So what we potentially have the opportunity to do now, and this is sort of how I hope this plays out, but obviously we don't know. The way I hope this plays out is that Bitcoin now acts as a cornerstone demand globally, so long as you're in a jurisdiction where you have some rule of law and some protection of private property. But Bitcoin now acts as sort of a global electricity buyer of last resort, like a cornerstone demand that will come and eat up whatever it is that you have to offer of the cheapest possible electricity. And it can then drive the profitability of these projects, even though they're built just wherever, if you will. And if we can use Bitcoin mining as sort of the cornerstone client there to make these projects profitable, to drive their scale to levels where they become big enough that grid connections make economical sense, we're doing a net benefit to the global renewables production. I mean, we got to keep in mind that people have this idea that Bitcoin mining is taking away from energy that we could be using on something else, but that's not actually true. Bitcoin mining cannot possibly compete with regular domestic demand for electricity. Domestic consumers of electricity, let's take London as an example. I think we pay something like 15 cents per kilowatt hour here, which is fine in the city. People will pay that. I will pay that to have my lights on and my computer running. But a Bitcoin miner can almost not a Bitcoin miner these days probably doesn't stand much of a chance of making a profit if he's mining on anything more than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see that as soon as the miners have to compete with regular either industrial or domestic demand, they they don't stand a chance. So Bitcoin miners of the future, if they became this like sort of bootstrapper of new renewables project, would be very nomadic, because they would sit at the renewables project and mine until the project was large enough that it made economical sense to connect it to the grid. As soon as you connect it to the grid, the prices would rise up to closer to the domestic levels, and the miners would be priced out and would have to move on to the next project. So there is a potential super interesting future role to be played for Bitcoin mining here. And I was at a conference last week, and I was actually I was very surprised to the level at which a lot of utilities themselves are looking at buying mining equipment to distribute it throughout their grid to deal with grid overload. There's a lot of inefficiencies out there in the grids, and there's a lot of electricity essentially being wasted every day. I mean, the grids are in perpetual overproduction just to make sure that we don't get brownouts. And a lot of electricity is wasted daily just to make sure that everything stays on. And the utilities themselves are looking at Bitcoin as a potential way of monetizing this, which would also be an extremely interesting future development. So there's a lot of stuff happening. There's also a lot of miners talking about complete vertical integration, where they literally build and operate their own power plants. Like, fascinating stuff happening in this industry.
That is really interesting. The concept of utilities actually becoming small miners in their own regards, and just the concept of maybe even incentivizing investment in rural and better rural power, or just bringing power to rural communities that are near renewable resources, using Bitcoin mining as a cornerstone permanently, or just to get it off the ground to provide a certain amount of time of monetary investment and income stream. I also thought it was really interesting, part of the report you talked about, Iceland was mentioned as being one of the areas where large-scale Bitcoin mining was occurring, not on the scale of China, but they're using geothermal there. How prevalent is that within the whole of Bitcoin mining?
Iceland has a pretty heavy share of geothermal in its energy mix. And there is a significant amount of mining happening in Iceland, and geothermal is quite cheap. So Iceland is one of those places where they have an incredible abundance of energy, and very high production of electricity and very high consumption of electricity. I think the Icelandic probably have one of the highest electricity spends per capita in the world, and they've been sort of so both Iceland and my good old native Norway have this same type of issue, in that we have huge amounts of renewable electricity just as a potential, and very small populations. So there's always been this question of how do you export this stuff, and it's been solved in kind of the same way. So you use aluminum smelting as like a proxy for exporting energy, because it is an extremely energy intensive process. But so you essentially import bauxite, then you smelt it into aluminum, which it takes a huge energy output, and then you export the aluminum, and that's sort of how they've been doing it. And this makes all the sense, because, like you said, like geothermal is extremely cheap. You essentially have just steam coming out of the ground. You put a turbine over it, and then you just essentially have to pay back the cost of the turbine. You don't have any fuel cost. You have a little bit of maintenance, and that's about it. There's a lot lower capex than if you're doing hydro, where you have to build a gigantic dam and lots of concrete goes into that. You're like you're ruining like a local river ecosystem, and there's all sorts of consequences. Whereas geothermal is just kind of loud and annoying, and that's about it. And it's extremely cheap. So if you get access to geothermal electricity, I mean, again, it depends. It's like not all the geothermal power plants in Iceland are sort of the same price. You know, if you're near the demand centers, the price is always higher. If you're away from them, it's cheaper. So this is kind of how it goes. So Bitcoin has a tendency now to just be done. Bitcoin mining tends to be done in the middle of nowhere, all of a sudden, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is, because I lived out in that area, kind of like that in Idaho, in the American West, where power is really cheap due to a lot of hydro and other renewables like that. And it was one of the reasons actually I was mining very small scale out there, but just because the power is just so extremely cheap. I think it was sub 5 cents if I'm not around 5 cents a kilowatt, which is not as cheap as China, but for the United States is actually pretty cheap. And I ended up having to sell it because we're moving it was going to double or maybe even 2.5x my energy costs to continue to. But I was just kind of taken, fascination of this idea of fusing private investment and incentives in the Bitcoin network in bringing better power alternatives to rural communities, or bringing better, more efficient, renewable, resources and power just online into the world, just because it is incentivized within the Bitcoin system. Just because there's a lot of communities that just don't have that. I mean, I remember even just where I grew up in Alaska. There were more in the rural areas, but they would actually be run on large diesel generators. It was subsidized heavily. Obviously, the individuals there were not paying for it directly.
Someone eats it.
Yeah, no, somebody definitely does eat that cost. But I didn't have any questions left on my end that I wanted to cover. I was wondering if there's any final thoughts or anything that I may have missed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just happy that somebody even wants to talk about it. Like most of the time, people see mining as this extremely boring type of thing that just goes on and no one really cares about. But I think it's a super fascinating like industry. The fact that we can have a decentralized clock is pretty cool, and I feel like this kind of gets lost in all of these like consensus model debates. People talk about, like, for example, proof of stake as like a comparable alternative to proof of work, and it's not. It doesn't act in the same way at all. Like proof of stake is like a delegation of authority based on certain criteria, but proof of work is actually a decentralized, distributed, universal clock, and it's never really talked about as that. And it's interesting because if you read how Satoshi described the blockchain, he never called it that. He called it a time chain. And in the white paper, the section where he talks about proof of work, he lays it out pretty clearly that the reason we need to do this is in order to create a distributed timestamping server. And it sort of makes all the sense, because you kind of only need two rules for people to agree on like a distributed set of money. The first one being that anyone can only spend money once. And in order to actually enforce that, you need everyone to agree on the time ordering of transactions. And that is what proof of work does. Like, work implies time. Like if we get a little like physical here in back to our physics 101, like work is force times it's the product of force and time. So if work has been done, that means that you can imply time from it. And this is why proof of work is such a brilliant solution to the distributed clock problem, is that we can now know certainly that time has passed based on these essentially thermodynamical principles. It's remarkable. It's super cool. And these other type of consensus algorithms, if you will, are not comparable. They're not in the same class as proof of work. They do something else. They have completely different trust models, and they require completely different assumptions for the people who are in the system. So, yeah, I'm a proof of work fanboy.
No, I do agree. I think that mining kind of gets pushed to the background a bit when you're talking about the possibilities of the whole space and everything. We're looking at the tech and development, but it usually only gets brought up in terms of scaling debates. And when you see these hit pieces being written in Forbes and other periodicals and saying Bitcoin's going to boil the oceans, and I think that it's a very low-hanging fruit type of thing for critics of Bitcoin to grab onto. But as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, I think it's going to be something we see more and more of as this, and it's why I wanted to do this interview, because I think this is going to be an evergreen topic for quite a few years to come. But I think it's going to be very important, because I think we're just going to continue to hear this trope being amplified more and more. And I think it's really important for us to talk about this as a community more, to take this more head on, and be a lot more concerned with this attack vector.
Yeah, agreed. And I think this is like an attack vector that the young generation will be especially susceptible to, because they are so sensitive to the climate issue these days. So, this is part of like our motivation to do this, is that we need there to be more data-driven research out there, so that these kids can like look at real data and make up their own mind, instead of just reading these like sensationalized headlines and think, oh my God, like this is just another, awful thing on top of the pile of BS that we already have to deal with from like the previous generations, like ruining our world. And I just want to make sure that they don't just fall for this like false narrative immediately, and that there's something out there for them to go look at and check out for themselves. And obviously our hope is that more data-driven research on mining is going to come out, and this is sort of going to create its own little ecosystem of research. So, we're hopeful. There are a bunch of interesting groups out there that are thinking about it. It's just, I just feel like mining has this like boring reputation, so not everyone kind of sees its importance immediately.
And it's funny you bring up the younger people, because I was just looking at this study that was done, and it was done in the fall of 2017, so it was kind of at the height of the bull market. But they did this study, and basically the question was like, if you had $1,000, what would you invest in? And millennials, about 20 to 30%, said that they would take that $1,000 and they would rather invest in Bitcoin over things like stocks and bonds or mutual funds or things like that. Where 65 and older were only at 5%. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head, where this is going to be a wedge issue for a lot of, to be used to drive away support from a demographic that has the most support for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and we can't let that happen, because in reality, there's no talk about the environmental disaster of committee control of important economic metrics like interest rates. Like, let's talk about the environmental impact of the mega level of malinvestment that happens due to artificial interest rates. Like, this is a gigantic problem too, or that is a problem. Whereas I don't see Bitcoin energy consumption as that big of a problem. I mean, think about the environmental impact you get just from malinvestment in mega infrastructure. Whenever interest rates are artificially kept low at these rates, like, you have projects go through that should never have gone through. You have wastage on the orders of billions and billions of dollars every year. So it's not like the alternative we have is this like pristine, super green alternative. Like, you can argue that gold mining, Bitcoin mining is a waste on a lot of levels. You could argue that, but the alternative is even worse, right? The alternative is first of all not having sound money, and the alternative is having committee decisions actually determine the level of the cost of capital in a society. I mean, that's absurd. So, we have to keep in mind that we can't compare it sort of to nothing. We have to compare it to the alternative that we already have, and the alternative we already have is pretty bad.
No, exactly. I think when we talk about malinvestment, I remember after the 2008 housing crisis, I remember reading an article, and it was specifically about Ireland, where just those false signals being sent out to the market were telling people to build, and in Ireland they actually built more houses than they had people to move into them, just because the market was telling them build, flip, sell, build, sell, flip, or whatever, right? And it's just insane that there's this malinvestment through false signals in the market, where Bitcoin sends out very clear signals and tells very clear signals to entrepreneurs who want to build in this market what the system, what the network needs now, what the network is going to need in the future, and doesn't have this issue, say, with malinvestment that markets using fiat tend to do and tend to have. And right now, miners are constantly sending out signals that they need cheap, renewable forms of energy. And I think it's Bitcoin is superior because it sends out very clear signals.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and this is something that I personally would like a return to. I feel like the market does a better job at this than a committee, as with most things. So, to me, it would be very interesting to see like how business cycles in the future could look if we just have true signaling coming from the market itself.
So how do people follow you? Where do they find you? And who do you want to hear from?
I mean, people can get a hold of me on Twitter, probably the easiest. Just like shoot me a message there, and I'll sort of back follow people, and we can DM. I mean, I would love to. We always want to hear from actual miners, first of all, because getting feedback from the people that actually are in the industry on whether or not our assumptions are reasonable is extremely valuable. Unfortunately, the people that tend to opine the most about our assumptions are people that are not in the industry. So while that is interesting and helpful, it's even more helpful if we get people that are actually involved. There is a certain level of wisdom of the crowd that goes into some of our estimates, and the more data points we have there, the better. So, if you read our report and look at it and think, this does not look like it's correct, like, please let me know. We'll listen and change up our assumption as we go. We don't pretend that the models that we use are perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So any feedback to tweak them and sharpen them is always welcome.
And I will have all of Christopher's contact information, as well as for Coinshare, the Twitter handles, website address, everything like that, as well as any of the links, articles, the tweet storm, everything that we mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes at didyouknowcrypto.com/28. That's didyouknowcrypto.com/28. And once again, Christopher, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.